The courtroom was colder than it had any right to be. Not just the air conditioning, but the way the silence pressed against my skin, sharp and deliberate, as if the room itself had already chosen a side. My husband stood a few feet away from me, relaxed, confident, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the counsel table. He didn't look at me at first. He didn't need to. He already believed the ending was written. When he finally leaned closer, his voice was low, careful, meant only for me. "Don't cry now," he whispered. "You'll need those tears later, when I take the house." Before I could respond, his mistress let out a soft laugh behind him, the kind that was meant to sound harmless. "And the car," she added, like she was reminding him to grab milk on the way home. Then came the last cut. My father-in-law, seated in the front row with the ease of a man who was used to being obeyed, smiled at me. Not cruelly, not loudly, but with certainty. "And whatever dignity you think you have left," he said quietly. I didn't answer, I didn't flinch, I didn't cry. They took my silence as surrender. The judge entered moments later, robe flowing, expression unreadable. Everyone rose. The ritual played out exactly as it always did. When we sat again, the confidence in my husband's posture only grew. He adjusted his jacket, exchanged a knowing glance with his attorney, and settled in as if this courtroom belonged to him. They had no idea I had chosen this day on purpose. The clerk called our case, and the sound echoed more loudly than it should have. My husband's attorney stood first, crisp and prepared, while I remained seated, hands folded neatly in my lap. I could feel eyes flick toward me, curious, dismissive, already bored. To them, I was the woman who had lost before she spoke. My husband didn't bother to hide his calm. He leaned back slightly, arms loose at his sides, the picture of a man who had nothing left to fear. His mistress crossed her legs behind him, scrolling idly on her phone until a sharp look from the bailiff reminded her where she was. Even then, she smirked. My father-in-law sat perfectly still. He didn't need to perform. Men like him never did. Authority followed them into rooms without being invited. As the opening statements began, my mind didn't drift. It sharpened. I listened as my marriage was reduced to neat paragraphs and polite phrases. I was described as emotional, inconsistent, difficult. A woman who had failed to adapt. A woman who had been supported far longer than she deserved. Each sentence landed exactly where it was meant to, on paper, in record, shaping a version of me that would be easy to dismiss. I took notes, slowly, carefully. From the corner of my eye I saw my husband glance over, his lips twitching upward. To him, this was mercy. He believed I should be grateful it was ending quietly. What he didn't understand was that silence is only weakness when it's unintentional. I had learned long ago that reacting too soon only gives power to the wrong people. In rooms like this, the person who speaks last often speaks loudest. So I waited. I watched. I counted breaths. I measured tone. The judge asked a procedural question, her voice even, her gaze neutral. My husband's attorney answered smoothly, as expected. Nothing unexpected, nothing dramatic. And yet something shifted. Not in them, in me. Because beneath the folder on my lap, tucked carefully against my knee, was a single envelope. Plain, unmarked, thin enough to look unimpressive. No logos, no labels, no hint of what it carried. Compared to the stacks of documents spread across their table, it looked almost ridiculous. My husband glanced at it once and dismissed it immediately. I saw it in his eyes. One envelope couldn't compete with years of preparation, with power, with money, with the confidence of men who had never been challenged. That was their first mistake. The courtroom droned on, words stacking on words, arguments delivered with practiced ease. I stayed quiet. I let them build their version of the truth uninterrupted. I let them believe I had nothing to counter it with. The judge nodded occasionally, her pen moving across her pad. She didn't look at me once. Good. By the time my husband's attorney finished, the tension in the room had softened into something close to certainty. He returned to his seat, satisfied. My husband leaned toward his father, whispering something that made the older man's mouth curve in approval. They thought the hardest part was over. I tightened my grip on the envelope, feeling the edge press into my palm, grounding me. Everything that followed depended on timing. Not courage, not emotion, timing. When the judge finally looked up and asked if there was anything further before proceeding, my heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I knew exactly when I would stand. And I knew exactly what would happen after I did. Because this wasn't the beginning of my defeat. It was the moment their certainty became their downfall. I stayed seated as the voices carried on around me, the rhythm of the courtroom steady and controlled. Lawyers spoke in careful sentences, objections were noted, dates were referenced. I listened, but my mind moved backward, tracing the quiet path that had led me here. I hadn't become invisible overnight. It happened slowly, so slowly that for a long time I didn't even have a word for it. When I married him, people called us solid, dependable, the kind of couple others trusted. We didn't fight in public, we didn't overshare. We hosted holidays on time and sent thank you notes afterward. From the outside, our marriage looked calm, almost boring, which people mistook for strength. At first, I did too. In the early years, I believed stability meant safety. We made decisions together, or at least I thought we did. I adjusted my schedule when his ran late. I softened my opinions when his family preferred something else. I told myself compromise was the price of peace. His father was always present, but not in a way that felt threatening at first. He watched more than he spoke. When he did speak, others listened. I mistook that for wisdom. I mistook his approval for acceptance. I didn't realize how carefully I was being measured. The first signs were small. Conversations that paused when I walked into a room. Plans that were mentioned after they'd already been decided. I was told it was easier that way, more efficient, less stress for me. I nodded, I smiled, I believed them. There were dinners where my opinion was asked only after everyone else had agreed. Meetings where my role was summarized instead of discussed. I noticed it, but I explained it away. Everyone has phases, I told myself. Every family has dynamics. What I didn't understand then was that silence is never neutral. My husband began deferring upward, not sideways. He stopped asking what I thought and started telling me what his father believed was best. It was subtle at first, wrapped in phrases that sounded reasonable, practical, sensible. "We'll see," became "my father thinks." "This might work" became "this is how it needs to be." I felt the shift before I could name it. Decisions were no longer something we made together. They were something I was informed of, often after the fact. When I pushed back, gently, carefully, I was told I was overthinking things, that I was being emotional. So I learned to make myself smaller. I let things go. I stopped insisting on being heard. I chose harmony over clarity, peace over presence. Each time I did, something in the room changed. People relaxed when I stopped asking questions. Conversations flowed more easily when I didn't interrupt them with my concerns. That should have frightened me. Instead, I took it as progress. His father's influence grew quietly, like ivy climbing a wall. There were moments of kindness, well-timed and strategic, compliments followed by dismissals, praise paired with subtle reminders of my place. I couldn't accuse him of cruelty. He never raised his voice. He never insulted me directly. He didn't have to. The message was clear in the way he redirected conversations, in the way he framed decisions as necessities rather than choices. He spoke about the future as if I were an accessory to it, not a participant, and each time my husband followed his lead. I was still married, I was still present, but I was no longer consulted. There was a meeting that stands out now, sharper in hindsight than it felt at the time. A family discussion about long-term plans, investments, commitments, things that would shape the next decade. I wasn't invited. It was explained to me later as a logistical decision. Too complicated, too much to go into. No one noticed the way my voice caught when I asked why. I told myself not to overreact. I told myself this was temporary, that patience would earn me respect, that silence would keep the peace. I believed that if I stayed reasonable, if I stayed calm, I would eventually be brought back into the circle. What I didn't see was that the circle had already closed. Looking back, I understand now that invisibility isn't about absence. It's about being present and disregarded, about standing in a room and realizing no one is adjusting their words for you anymore. In the courtroom, a chair scraped softly against the floor, pulling me back to the present. The judge made a note. My husband's attorney continued speaking, his tone confident, precise. They were describing a woman who didn't exist, or rather, a woman they had helped create by slowly erasing the real one. I sat there, listening, feeling the strange calm that comes when the past finally makes sense. Every moment I had dismissed, every instinct I had quieted, every time I had chosen not to speak. That was how it happened. Not through one betrayal, but through a series of small permissions I gave others to decide who I was allowed to be. I didn't know it then, but that meeting I wasn't invited to was the moment my role was rewritten. By the time I realized I had stopped being essential, they had already moved on without me. The first time I heard her name, it didn't register as a threat. It was mentioned casually, slipped into conversation the way people mention a service provider or a distant colleague. My husband said it without looking at me, as if the word itself didn't deserve attention. "She helped streamline a few things," he said. "Nothing you need to worry about." A day later, my father-in-law repeated the name, his tone approving, almost fond. "She's reliable," he added. "She understands what matters." I remember standing there listening, feeling a faint tug of discomfort I couldn't explain. Her name carried familiarity I hadn't earned. It was spoken as if she had already been around for a while, as if I were the one arriving late to the story. At first, she existed only in fragments, messages forwarded through my husband, decisions attributed to her suggestions. "She thinks this would be more efficient." She said this might avoid complications. Each time it was framed as helpful, necessary, temporary. When I asked questions, my husband grew defensive in a way that felt disproportionate to the situation. He assured me I was imagining tension where there was none. He reminded me how much pressure everyone was under, how important it was not to complicate things. I told myself I was being unreasonable. I told myself not every unfamiliar name was a threat. Then I realized she knew things about my household I had never shared. She referenced schedules, preferences, details that only came from observation, not hearsay. When I asked how she knew, my husband waved it off. "She's thorough," he said. "That's why my father trusts her." The first time I met her in person, it wasn't at an office or a restaurant, it was in my home. She arrived unannounced, introduced with a casual gesture, as if her presence required no explanation. She moved through the space comfortably, not cautiously, her eyes scanning the room like someone taking inventory. She smiled at me politely, but there was no uncertainty in it, no hesitation. She behaved like someone who already belonged. My father-in-law directed most of the conversation toward her, asking her opinion, acknowledging her responses with nods of approval. My husband stood slightly to the side, watching, attentive in a way I hadn't seen in months. I felt like a guest in my own house. At one point, she thanked me for something I hadn't agreed to. She did it warmly, confidently, as if the decision had already been finalized. I looked at my husband, expecting him to correct her. He didn't. That was the moment something shifted. Not dramatically, quietly, like a door closing in another room. After that, changes came quickly. Household routines adjusted without discussion, plans altered without notice. When I objected gently, I was told I was misremembering things, that I had agreed earlier, that I must have misunderstood. I began to question myself, to replay conversations in my head, searching for moments I might have missed. I worried about sounding defensive, about appearing insecure. I told myself to stay calm, to stay reasonable. Meanwhile, she continued to gain ground. My husband started watching me instead of her when tensions rose. He studied my reactions, measured my responses, as if waiting for something. I realized then that this wasn't about conflict between women. It was about control. The confirmation came from my father-in-law. One afternoon he spoke to me privately, his voice low and composed. He didn't accuse me of anything. He didn't raise concerns. He spoke in abstractions about stability, about suitability, about the future. He framed it as responsibility, as foresight. "She understands how things work," he said, referring to her. "She's a solution." The word landed heavier than any insult. I understood then that this wasn't a romantic betrayal, it was a strategic one. She hadn't replaced me emotionally. She had been installed, approved, positioned. I wasn't competing with her. I was being evaluated against standards I hadn't agreed to, judged in rooms I wasn't invited into. My failure wasn't dramatic, it was procedural. The clarity was chilling. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The careful way my father-in-law guided conversations, the way my husband deferred to him, the way she fit neatly into a structure that had been forming long before she arrived. They weren't hiding an affair, they were executing a plan. I stopped wondering why I felt uneasy. I stopped blaming myself for feeling displaced. The hurt was still there, sharp and personal, but it hardened into something else. Awareness, vigilance. I realized I was being assessed, not loved, measured, not partnered, and by their standards, I was failing. That understanding didn't make me angry right away. It made me quiet. Because when you finally see the shape of the trap, the first instinct isn't to run. It's to learn how it closes. The moment felt ordinary enough that I almost ignored it. I was sorting through paperwork at the kitchen counter, the kind of quiet task that barely registers as part of the day. Bills, notices, documents that had accumulated without ceremony. Nothing about it suggested danger. And yet, there it was. That faint tightening in my chest, the sense that something in front of me did not belong. The folder wasn't where I usually kept it. That was the first thing. It sat slightly apart from the rest, angled as if someone had placed it down quickly and meant to return. My name was printed on the tab, but the way it appeared made me pause. It wasn't centered, it wasn't emphasized. It was almost an afterthought. I opened it. The language inside was clean, precise, stripped of emotion. It spoke of adjustments, of restructuring, of efficiency. I read it once without fully understanding what I was seeing. Then again, slower. My role was referenced, but only to clarify its absence. Decisions had been made. Authority reassigned. Rights reduced. There was no signature from me. No line for consent. No acknowledgement that I should have been involved at all. For a moment, confusion eclipsed everything else. I searched the page for an explanation, a footnote, some indication that this was incomplete. My hands felt cold as I turned the pages, hoping for context that would soften the meaning. It didn't come. What did come was a date. The document had been drafted months earlier, long before any open conflict, before raised voices, before tension had become visible. It predated the conversations I had thought were the beginning of the end. That was when the confusion gave way to something steadier. This wasn't an oversight, it was preparation. My first instinct was to confront my husband immediately, to place the document in front of him and demand an explanation. I could already hear the questions forming in my head, sharp and direct. Why wasn't I consulted? Who authorized this? How long had this been planned? I didn't ask any of them. Something in me recognized that reacting now would only expose how little I understood. If this document existed, there were others. If it had been hidden, it was meant to surface later, when it could do the most damage. So I closed the folder, carefully, quietly. I slid it back into place, exactly as I'd found it, and walked away. That evening I tested the air. I mentioned something tangential, casual enough to seem unimportant. A question about timelines, about decisions that had been made recently. I watched my husband's face as he responded. His answer was smooth, rehearsed, slightly vague. Too vague. When I pressed gently, he deflected. When I changed the subject, he relaxed. My father-in-law, seated across the room, redirected the conversation without missing a beat. They already knew I didn't know everything. That realization settled over me slowly, heavy, but clarifying. I replayed the past months in my mind, scenes rearranging themselves with new meaning. The meetings I hadn't attended. The decisions announced after they were final. The quiet insistence that I was better off not worrying about details. It wasn't neglect. It was design. I started noticing patterns everywhere. Documents that appeared and disappeared. Conversations that ended abruptly when I entered the room. The way my husband's tone shifted when discussing anything related to the future. The way my father-in-law framed choices as inevitabilities rather than options. They weren't hiding chaos, they were building order, an order that didn't require me. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling as the house settled into silence. The document replayed in my mind, its language cold and deliberate. I thought about what it meant to see something you weren't meant to see. You can pretend you never found it. Or you can accept that once you know, you've crossed a line you can't uncross. I chose the second. The next morning I returned to the folder. I didn't take it. I didn't photograph it. I memorized it. Dates, phrases, structure. I paid attention to what was included, and what was conspicuously absent. I began to understand how this would unfold if I did nothing, how I would be presented later with a version of events already documented, already justified, how my objections would sound emotional, reactive, unreliable. They were building a case, not just legally but narratively. And I was expected to play my part without ever reading the script. That was the moment I made my choice. I wouldn't confront them, not yet. I wouldn't signal awareness. I wouldn't ask questions that could be documented or dismissed. Instead, I would watch, I would listen, I would collect. If they believed I was still in the dark, they would continue moving as planned. They would grow careless, comfortable. I slipped the folder back into its place, my movements precise. As I closed the drawer, my reflection caught briefly in the metal handle. I looked calm, unchanged. But something fundamental had shifted. This document wasn't just the first proof that I had been excluded. It was the first layer of a structure meant to erase me quietly, efficiently, without conflict. And now that I had seen it, I knew one thing for certain. I stopped asking questions after that. Not because I didn't want answers, but because I finally understood what questions cost me. Every time I asked why, every time I pushed for clarity, the room tightened, voices softened, words became careful, and somewhere, something invisible was recorded. So I went quiet. The change was immediate, almost relieving for them. When I stopped insisting on explanations, the tension in the house eased. My husband smiled more. Conversations flowed again, lighter, freer. My father-in-law seemed almost pleased, as if I had finally learned the rules of a game I hadn't known I was playing. Silence, I realized, made people careless. They spoke more openly around me once they believed I no longer mattered. Plans were discussed in my presence, as if I were furniture. Decisions were announced instead of debated. I was thanked for my understanding, praised for being reasonable. Each compliment felt like confirmation. I began to notice things I'd missed before, glances exchanged over my head, conversations that resumed too quickly after a pause. The way my husband avoided specifics but volunteered reassurance, the way my father-in-law framed outcomes as inevitable, as if resistance were childish. And I watched. I listened to how they spoke about timelines, about next steps, about what would happen once this is settled. I noticed which words repeated themselves, which phrases sounded practiced, which concerns never came up at all. They were preparing for an exit, not a separation, not a discussion, but a clean removal. Legal conversations were disguised as routine. Financial adjustments were framed as efficiency. My name appeared less and less, replaced by neutral language that reduced me to a variable, an inconvenience to be managed. I heard my husband say something one evening that didn't belong in a marriage. He didn't realize I was within earshot. "This will be easier once it's on record," he said, his voice calm, almost relieved. Easier for whom, he didn't specify. I understood then the role they expected me to play. I was meant to unravel, to react emotionally, to protest at the wrong time in the wrong way. My resistance would become evidence. My pain would be documented and reframed. They weren't just ending a marriage, they were constructing a story. And I was supposed to confirm it for them. So I didn't. I practiced neutrality. I measured my reactions. I let provocations pass without comment. When decisions were announced, I nodded. When my input was bypassed, I smiled. I stopped defending myself because I realized defense was exactly what they wanted. Knowledge gave me a calm they mistook for weakness. Inside, I cataloged everything: dates, language, shifts in tone. I learned to hear what wasn't said. I learned how quickly people reveal themselves when they believe they're no longer being observed. They underestimated how much you can see when no one is watching you back. There was a moment, late one afternoon, when it became unmistakable. A decision was made openly in front of me, involving something that directly affected my future. No one asked my opinion. No one explained the reasoning. It was delivered as a conclusion. My husband didn't even look at me when it happened. That was the moment I knew I was no longer considered a threat. And that was the moment I became dangerous. Once they stopped accounting for me, I could move freely. I could listen without being guarded against. I could notice without being interrupted. They had already written me out of the narrative, and in doing so, they had handed me access. I began paying attention to who else was absent. There are always people a family stops mentioning, names that disappear from conversation, stories that end abruptly. At the time, I had accepted those silences as none of my business. Now they felt intentional. I thought back to the early years, to moments I'd dismissed, to warnings I hadn't understood. There was someone they never referred to anymore. Someone who had once been close enough to matter and inconvenient enough to be erased. The idea took hold quietly, like a thought you don't want to have, because once you do, it changes everything. That night, as the house settled and the familiar routines played out around me, I made a decision of my own. Not a confrontation, not a declaration, a pivot. If they believed I was isolated, I would let them. If they believed I was broken, I would play the part. But I would not continue pretending I didn't see what was happening. I waited until I was alone before reaching for my phone, my fingers steady despite the weight of the choice. I searched for a name I hadn't spoken in years, one they had forgotten I remembered. When I found it, I hesitated only once. Then I pressed send. Because if they thought the game was already over, they had made their final mistake. And they had made it while I was still watching. Everything inside the family had become compromised. I could feel it in the way conversations bent around me, in how loyalty flowed upward and never sideways. Trust, if it existed at all, had been rerouted long before I realized I needed it. So I stopped looking for answers where they had already been buried. There was one name they never mentioned anymore. Not casually, not accidentally. It had vanished so completely that its absence felt intentional, like a room everyone agreed not to enter. I hadn't thought about it in years, not seriously. At the time, I'd accepted the explanation given to me, the vague reassurances, the quiet redirection. Now that silence felt heavy. I remembered him from the early days of my marriage. He had been around often enough to matter, close enough to notice things others ignored. He wasn't family, not officially, but he had been trusted once. Until he wasn't. Then he disappeared, and with him went a set of stories that were never finished. I realized then how carefully history can be edited. It took me a full day to decide whether to reach out. Not because I was afraid of what he might say, but because I understood what it would mean if he answered. Reaching outside the family meant acknowledging that everything inside it was already lost. That night, I sent a message that said very little, just enough to open a door without knocking it down. I didn't explain myself. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply asked if he remembered me. The reply came hours later. Of course I do. It wasn't warm. It wasn't cold. It was cautious. And beneath it, something else. Expectation. We spoke briefly at first. Neutral ground, careful language. He didn't ask why I was reaching out. I didn't volunteer it. There was an understanding between us that some conversations only happen when the timing is right. When we finally met, it wasn't dramatic. No confrontations, no raised voices. We sat across from each other in a quiet place where no one cared who we were. He looked older than I remembered, but not diminished. If anything, he looked lighter, as if distance had given him clarity. He didn't waste time. "They always planned to erase you," he said calmly, as if stating a fact he'd accepted long ago. I felt the words settle, not as a shock, but as confirmation. He explained what he knew, carefully, without embellishment. Past decisions made quietly. Situations resolved without records. People removed without explanation. He spoke about my father-in-law with a precision that made my skin prickle. The family's strength, he said, had never been money. It was narrative. Control over how stories were told, how mistakes were framed, how responsibility was redirected. When something threatened that balance, it was absorbed or eliminated. I asked why he'd left. He smiled once thinly. I asked the wrong question. What he knew mattered not because it was explosive, but because it was contextual. He didn't hand me documents or recordings. He gave me something more dangerous: understanding. He showed me how patterns formed, how decisions connected, how small acts of exclusion built toward inevitability. He also made one thing very clear: help would not be free. He wasn't asking for money. He wasn't asking for favors. His condition was patience, absolute restraint. If I acted too early, if I exposed even a hint of what I knew, the entire structure would shift to protect itself. They've survived worse than this, he said, barely, but only because people panicked. I understood what he was asking. To let them finish their plan. To allow the story they were constructing to reach its natural conclusion. Only then would the cracks matter. If I acted too soon, I would lose everything. I left that meeting with no proof in my hands, no evidence I could point to. But I wasn't empty-handed. I carried direction. A sense of where pressure lived and where it didn't. A map of a system that depended on silence to function. For the first time in months, fear loosened its grip. I wasn't guessing anymore. They believed I was isolated, that I had no allies, that my silence was the result of exhaustion, not calculation. My husband continued playing his role with quiet confidence. My father-in-law moved pieces into place with practiced ease. They didn't see the shift. They couldn't, because nothing about my behavior changed. I remained agreeable. I remained distant. I remained exactly the version of myself they expected. But inside, something fundamental had realigned. I no longer wondered what they were capable of. I no longer hoped for fairness. I understood the scale of what I was facing, and that understanding gave me something steadier than anger. Clarity. The divorce was only the surface, a mechanism, a distraction. Beneath it lay something larger, something that had been managed for years through silence and compliance. And now that silence had moved. As I drove home that evening, the city lights blurred past my windshield, familiar streets taking on new meaning. I wasn't thinking about confrontation or revenge. I was thinking about timing, about restraint, about the difference between exposing a secret and letting it collapse under its own weight. They believed the worst was already behind them. They were wrong. The real reckoning hadn't even begun. Whatever they thought was coming next, it would not unfold the way they planned. The papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the kind of efficiency that leaves no room for misunderstanding. A neutral envelope, a professional courier. No warning, no conversation beforehand, just a signature line and the quiet implication that something irreversible had already begun. I stood in the entryway long after the door closed, the envelope resting against my palm like a weight I had been expecting. The timing was deliberate. They had chosen a moment when I would be alone, when there would be no witnesses to my first reaction. Panic, they assumed. Tears. A phone call made too quickly to the wrong person. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table and opened it carefully. The language was colder than I expected, efficient, absolute. It asked for everything that mattered and framed it as inevitability. Assets, authority, control. My contributions were summarized in a way that felt almost charitable, as if acknowledging them too much would undermine the argument they were building. There was a paragraph about my temperament, another about my reliability. Each sentence was measured, polished, designed to sound reasonable while carving me down to something unstable. It wasn't a request, it was an extraction. The date on the filing confirmed what I already knew. This had been planned long before I saw the document in the folder, long before my silence, long before I stopped asking questions. The divorce wasn't a response to conflict. It was the next phase of a process already underway. My phone rang less than an hour later. My husband's voice was calm when I answered, careful in the way people are when they believe they're being kind. He spoke slowly, as if trying not to startle me. "I wanted you to hear it from me," he said. "This doesn't have to be ugly." He framed the filing as inevitable, necessary, something that would be easier if I didn't resist. He suggested mediation, cooperation. He spoke about minimizing stress, about moving forward with dignity. Not once did he apologize. When I didn't respond right away, he filled the silence with reassurance. He told me he understood how hard this must be for me. He told me I'd be taken care of, within reason. He told me fighting would only make things worse. What he didn't say mattered more. He didn't ask how I felt. He didn't ask if I understood. He didn't ask if I wanted to talk it through. He assumed compliance the way one assumes gravity. When the call ended, I felt a strange, hollow calm, not shock, not grief, recognition. My father-in-law didn't call that day. He didn't need to. His presence was embedded in every choice that had been made. I recognized his hand in the structure of the filing, in the choice of attorney, in the precision of the demands. My husband wasn't leading this. He was executing it. The plan wasn't to divorce me. It was to remove me. They expected me to respond immediately, to hire the wrong lawyer in a rush, to send angry messages that could be documented, to show fear, to show instability. They wanted me reactive and exposed, my resistance neatly folded into their narrative. Every move I made now would be watched. Doing nothing, I realized, was the most dangerous choice of all. Deadlines loomed, response windows closed in. Each day that passed without action was meant to increase pressure, to force a mistake. I could feel it in the way my husband spoke to me afterward, his tone shifting subtly, checking for cracks. I could see it in the way my father-in-law began positioning himself, preparing for the aftermath. They thought time was on their side. I let them think that. I didn't rush to correct their version of events. I didn't push back publicly. I didn't explain myself to anyone who asked. When friends reached out with concern, I thanked them and said very little. When my husband offered help, I accepted it politely and asked for nothing. I played the role they had assigned me. Privately, I made a different decision. I would not respond on their timeline. I would not give them the satisfaction of my panic. I would allow the uncertainty to stretch, to unsettle them instead. I would let their confidence grow unchecked. Fear began to recede, replaced by calculation. Each day that passed without my reaction told them exactly what they wanted to hear, that I was overwhelmed, unprepared, already defeated. They didn't see the discipline it took to stay still. They didn't understand that I was waiting for the right moment, not to fight, but to let their own structure collapse under scrutiny. The more complete their story became, the harder it would be to rewrite when the truth surfaced. By the time the first deadline approached, they were already comfortable, assured. My husband spoke to me with quiet authority, as if explaining something to a child. My father-in-law watched from a distance, satisfied. They believed they had me cornered. And so I prepared to do exactly what they expected. I would appear hesitant, confused, cooperative in all the wrong ways. I would give them the performance they needed to stop being careful. Because once people believe they've won, they stop guarding the door. And that was when I planned to walk through it. I decided to give them exactly what they were waiting for. Not all at once, not dramatically. I let it happen in small, believable pieces. A missed call returned too late. A question asked twice. A hesitation before answering something simple. I allowed my voice to soften, my confidence to thin, just enough to look like strain. They noticed immediately. My husband stepped back into a role he clearly missed. He spoke more gently, more slowly, as if I might break if he moved too fast. He offered help without waiting to be asked, advice framed as concern. When I faltered, he nodded with quiet relief, as though the story he'd been telling himself was finally aligning with reality. "You don't have to handle this alone," he said one evening, his hand hovering near my shoulder without touching it. "I know this is hard for you." Hard for me, convenient for him. The more uncertain I appeared, the more relaxed he became. He stopped measuring his words so carefully. He explained things he hadn't bothered to before, not because he wanted me to understand, but because he believed I couldn't challenge them. Guilt, he assumed, had replaced resistance. His confidence fed my father-in-law's. For the first time in months, the older man addressed me directly, not with warmth, but with finality. He spoke as if the outcome was already settled, as if my presence was a formality he was gracious enough to acknowledge. "This will be better for everyone," he said, his tone patient, almost instructional. "Order matters. Stability matters. You'll see that eventually." He assumed I couldn't see beyond my own emotions, that I was incapable of understanding the larger structure he was protecting. I let him believe it. That was when they stopped being careful. Conversations began happening near me, not with me. Phones were left face up on tables. Documents were set down and forgotten. They spoke in shorthand now, referencing plans and dates without context, trusting I wouldn't connect them. I did. One afternoon I caught a fragment of conversation that didn't belong together. A date mentioned too casually. A phrase repeated from a document I'd memorized weeks earlier. It wasn't a confession. It was worse. It was confirmation. I didn't react. I didn't even look up. I stored it. From then on, I paid attention to the ordinary moments, the ones people dismiss as harmless. A door left ajar, a comment made in passing, a tone shift when certain names were mentioned. I wasn't searching for a dramatic mistake. I was collecting consistency. They were documenting me, every reaction filed away as proof of instability. I was doing the same, but quietly, invisibly. I captured what I needed without them realizing anything had changed. It wasn't dramatic, no secret recordings hidden in drawers, no frantic copying of files. Just patience, awareness, the understanding that people reveal more when they feel superior. The more broken I appeared, the more generous they became with their truth. There was a moment that cut deeper than the rest. I overheard my husband explaining the situation to someone else, his voice calm, assured. He spoke about me as if I weren't his wife, but a problem he had managed responsibly. "She's not handling it well," he said. "We expected that." Expected, planned for. The realization settled cold in my chest. This wasn't just about divorce. It was about dismantling me in a way that would look justified, about turning my reactions into evidence, my silence into agreement. Fear didn't spike the way it once would have. It hardened. I began organizing what I had, not physically yet, but mentally. I grouped moments by intention, not by time. I looked for what contradicted their narrative, what exposed coordination, what revealed that this wasn't a breakdown, but a strategy. I knew exactly what they wanted the judge to believe. That I was unstable, that I was emotional, that I couldn't be trusted with decisions, assets, authority, that I needed to be managed for my own good. And I understood finally how far they were willing to go to protect that version of events. That was the day I stopped reacting altogether. I didn't argue, I didn't ask follow-up questions. I didn't defend myself when assumptions were made out loud. I became still in a way that made people uncomfortable, but not enough to alarm them. They mistook it for resignation. It was preparation. Late that night, alone, I laid everything out in my mind. Not every detail belonged in court. Not every truth needed to be spoken. Some things were more powerful when left unsaid, when they forced others to fill in the gaps themselves. I knew what would go into the envelope. And I knew what would stay out. The envelope wasn't about overwhelming anyone with information. It was about precision, about placing the right piece in the right moment and letting the rest collapse under its own weight. By the time I turned off the light and let the house settle around me, my decision was complete. The performance was over. The pieces were in place. They thought the courtroom would be the end of this. They had no idea it was where their story would finally start unraveling. It became clear one evening as I sat alone, everything spread out in my mind like pieces of a puzzle that no longer resisted fitting together. None of this was really about money. I had spent weeks watching them maneuver, listening to the careful language, the rehearsed concern, the quiet certainty that assets could be redistributed and lives rearranged without consequence. But as I replayed each moment, each decision, a different pattern emerged. The urgency wasn't around property, it was around perception. What they were protecting wasn't wealth, it was credibility. They feared being seen, not being poor. Exposure, not loss, was the threat that kept them disciplined. My father-in-law understood this better than anyone. He had built his authority on being untouchable, on shaping narratives before questions could form. Control didn't come from force, it came from appearing inevitable. That was what they were defending. I stopped organizing what I knew by category. I didn't separate conversations from documents or dates from decisions. I reorganized everything by consequence. What would contradict sworn statements? What would undermine certainty? What would force someone to pause instead of proceed? I stripped the emotion out of it. Not because it wasn't there, but because emotion would only dilute the impact. Facts were sharper when they stood alone. I saw how one small detail could fracture their entire structure. A phrase repeated too consistently. A timeline that aligned too perfectly. A decision justified as independent that was clearly coordinated. Individually, each piece could be dismissed. Together, they told a story they couldn't control. That understanding brought with it a new kind of restraint. Acting too soon would protect them. I knew that now. Panic would trigger defenses. Accusations would close ranks. The system they relied on was built to absorb outrage and redirect blame. I had to avoid becoming the distraction. I had to let the evidence speak without me explaining it. There were things I chose deliberately not to include. Moments that would have satisfied me emotionally, but weakened the case intellectually. I wasn't there to humiliate anyone. I wasn't even there to be believed. I was there to make disbelief impossible. Some truths lose power when spoken too early. Some accusations invite denial simply by existing. Silence, used correctly, forces others to fill in gaps with their own logic. I wanted them talking, not me. I wanted contradictions to surface naturally, not defensively. That meant leaving certain things out. The envelope began to take its final form in my mind. It wasn't thick, it wasn't dramatic. It didn't look like justice. It looked like nothing at all, clean, minimal, unassuming. That was the point. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't even confrontation. It was alignment, evidence meeting authority, narrative meeting record. Once that happened, my presence became almost irrelevant. I felt no anger as I prepared it, no rush, no triumph, just a steady certainty that I was finally standing on solid ground. The fear that had once driven my silence was gone, replaced by something colder and more precise. Timing mattered more than volume. I chose when to submit it, not because I wanted attention, but because attention would arrive whether I invited it or not. The courtroom thrived on order. Disruption had to be surgical. They believed court was where they won because it followed rules they understood. Rules they had bent for years without consequence. What they didn't account for was how fragile certainty becomes when the right question is asked at the wrong time. I reviewed everything one last time, not to reassure myself, but to confirm restraint. There was nothing extraneous, nothing emotional, nothing that could be reframed as bitterness. Only alignment. The night before the hearing, I slept better than I had in months. Not because I expected victory, but because I trusted the process I had built. I didn't need to convince anyone of who I was. I only needed the truth to enter the record. They would do the rest. The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully, neutrally. Nothing that invited interpretation. Nothing that suggested defiance or collapse. I wanted to look like someone with nothing left to say. That was another miscalculation they would make. As I walked into the courthouse, I saw my husband already there, speaking confidently with his attorney. He laughed at something she said, relaxed, assured. My father-in-law stood nearby, composed as ever, nodding occasionally as if overseeing a routine transaction. They looked settled, certain. I took my seat without acknowledging them, the envelope tucked securely where it belonged. I felt no urge to look around, no need to gauge reactions. Everything that mattered was already in place. When proceedings began, I listened as they repeated their narrative one final time. Calm, polished, unchallenged. They spoke as if they were closing a chapter, not realizing they were opening one. I waited. Not because I was unsure, but because the moment had to belong to them first. Only then would its reversal matter. When the time came, I would not argue, I would not accuse, I would not explain. I would simply offer what they could no longer control. And let the truth do what it does best when it finally finds the light. The courtroom felt different the second time I noticed it. Heavier, quieter, as if the air itself had decided to wait. My husband sat at the counsel table with the ease of someone who believed the outcome was already secured. His jacket was perfectly pressed, his posture relaxed. Behind him, his mistress leaned back in her chair, her attention drifting, confidence bordering on boredom. My father-in-law occupied the front row, composed and still, watching the judge with the calm of a man accustomed to being deferred to. I felt none of what they expected me to feel. No nerves, no fear, no need to look at them at all. When proceedings resumed, my husband's attorney stood and began exactly where she had planned to begin. Her voice was smooth, controlled, respectful. She spoke of reason and stability, of necessary transitions and difficult decisions. She painted a portrait of inevitability so carefully that it almost felt kind. I was described as emotional, inconsistent, overwhelmed by circumstances beyond my control. The implication was clear without being stated outright. This wasn't a punishment, it was a rescue. As she spoke, I took notes, slowly, neatly. I didn't interrupt. I didn't shift in my seat. I didn't react when my name was paired with words designed to diminish it. From where they sat, I must have looked exactly as they hoped I would. Small, passive, already conceding. Their confidence deepened with every uninterrupted sentence. My husband glanced back once, catching my eye. There was a brief flicker of satisfaction there, quickly masked by practiced concern. He nodded almost imperceptibly, as if to reassure me that cooperation would be rewarded. I didn't return the gesture. The judge listened without expression, her pen moving steadily across the page. When the attorney finished, she paused, her gaze lowering briefly to her notes before lifting again. That pause was the first crack. It was subtle, a beat longer than necessary, enough to shift the room's rhythm. My husband's attorney adjusted her stance, ready to continue. My husband straightened slightly, alert but unconcerned. The judge asked a question. It was procedural on the surface, narrow, unassuming, but it required precision, and for the first time that morning, the answer wasn't immediate. My husband's attorney hesitated, then responded with confidence that arrived a fraction of a second too late. I saw my husband's jaw tighten. The judge nodded once, as if acknowledging something to herself, and made another note. Silence stretched. Not long enough to alarm anyone, long enough to be felt. That was when I stood. The movement drew attention instantly, chairs creaking softly as heads turned. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. I rose calmly, smoothing my jacket, my expression neutral. "Yes?" the judge said, looking directly at me for the first time. I spoke briefly, respectfully. I didn't argue the points that had been made. I didn't defend myself. I simply asked permission to submit an item into the record. The contrast was stark. Their stacks of binders, their color-coded tabs, their prepared exhibits. My single envelope. A whisper moved through the room, quickly silenced. My husband's attorney glanced at it dismissively, then at my husband. He gave a small shrug, the kind that suggested mild annoyance rather than concern. The judge gestured for it to be brought forward. As the bailiff took the envelope from my hand, my husband leaned toward his attorney, murmuring something under his breath. His mistress frowned, sitting up straighter now, her earlier boredom evaporating. My father-in-law remained still, but his gaze sharpened, following the envelope's path with new interest. They assumed it was too late for me to matter. The judge opened it carefully, as if aware that haste would grant it more drama than it deserved. She removed the contents and began reading, slowly, deliberately. The room went quiet in a way I hadn't experienced before. No shifting, no whispering. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade. I didn't look at them. I watched the judge's face instead, waiting for the change I knew would come. It did. Not anger, not shock. Recognition. She paused, her eyes moving back over a section she had already read. Her pen stopped. She adjusted her glasses, then continued, her expression tightening just enough to register. My husband shifted in his seat. His attorney leaned closer, trying to catch the judge's attention, to read her reaction. The mistress's confidence collapsed into something sharper, her hands gripping the edge of the chair. My father-in-law crossed his arms. The judge looked up then, not at me but at my husband. The silence deepened. Nothing had been said yet, no ruling, no accusation. And still, the atmosphere had changed completely. The certainty that had filled the room minutes earlier drained away, replaced by something brittle and uncertain. I felt no surge of triumph, no rush of vindication. Only calm. This was the moment I had prepared for. Not the verdict, not the consequences. This precise pause where control slipped before anyone realized it had been lost. The judge returned her gaze to the document, her expression unreadable once more. She turned a page, then another, each movement deliberate, unhurried. My husband swallowed. Whatever he had believed about this courtroom, about power, about preparation, about inevitability, was unraveling quietly, right in front of him. And this was only the beginning. The judge did not speak right away. She finished reading first, every page, every line, as if nothing else in the room existed. The silence stretched longer than anyone was comfortable with, the kind that presses against your chest and makes even confident people start to reconsider what they thought they knew. My husband's attorney shifted her weight. Once, then again. She opened her mouth as if to clarify something, then closed it when the judge raised a single finger without looking up. That small gesture did more damage than any accusation. When the judge finally set the papers down, she didn't look at me. She didn't look at my husband either. She leaned back slightly and studied the courtroom as a whole, as if reassessing the space itself. "This court takes sworn statements seriously," she said calmly. My husband straightened, instinctively nodding, eager to align himself with authority. His confidence flickered, but he kept his composure, the habit of obedience ingrained deep. The judge turned to his attorney first. "You stated earlier that certain decisions were made independently," she continued, "that no coordination existed prior to the filing of this action." "Yes, Your Honor," the attorney replied quickly. Too quickly. The judge lifted one page from the stack and held it up. "Then perhaps you can explain why identical language appears in 3 separate communications, authored weeks apart, by 3 different individuals." The color drained from my husband's face so suddenly it startled even me. His attorney leaned in, whispering urgently, her voice too low for words to carry but not low enough to hide panic. My husband shook his head once, sharply, as if the problem could be corrected with denial. The judge didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She turned her attention to my father-in-law. "Sir," she said, her tone polite but firm, "you are not a party to this case, and yet your involvement appears repeatedly throughout these materials." My father-in-law smiled, a practiced expression meant to convey respect and authority at once. "I was only offering guidance," he said, as any concerned parent would. The judge nodded slowly. "Guidance," she repeated, "is not the same as orchestration." That was when the room changed completely. My husband's mistress shifted in her seat, her earlier confidence replaced by visible unease. She glanced at him, searching for reassurance, but he didn't look back. His focus was locked on the judge now, his hands clenched tightly in front of him. The judge began asking questions, not aggressively, methodically. Each one was simple, direct. Each required an answer that fit with the last. And they didn't. Timelines overlapped where they shouldn't have. Decisions were justified by circumstances that hadn't yet occurred. Statements contradicted filings. Small inconsistencies surfaced first, then larger ones, like cracks spreading across glass. My husband's attorney attempted to intervene, to reframe, to redirect. The judge stopped her. "I did not ask you," she said, her voice still calm. I asked him. My husband opened his mouth. Closed it. Then spoke again, his voice unsteady now despite his effort to control it. He explained, clarified, adjusted, each answer drifting further from the certainty he had walked in with. I watched him unravel not emotionally, but structurally. The story he had rehearsed so carefully no longer fit the questions being asked. He wasn't prepared for inquiry that didn't follow the expected script. At one point, the judge paused again, this time looking directly at him. "Do you understand," she asked, "that this court does not respond well to manipulation presented as cooperation?" He nodded too quickly. "Yes, Your Honor." Her gaze lingered. "Do you?" That was the moment his attorney leaned in and whispered something urgent. 5 words, just 5. Whatever they were, they landed hard. My husband's face went completely still. The smugness, the confidence, the faint superiority he'd carried into the room. Gone. His hands began to tremble, just slightly, as if his body had realized the truth before his mind could accept it. The judge turned to me then. "Mrs.," she said, using my name with deliberate care. "Is there anything else you wish to add?" I stood slowly, my movements measured. "No, Your Honor," I said. "I believe the record speaks for itself." She regarded me for a moment longer, as if weighing something beyond the words. Then she nodded. "I agree." She gathered the papers into a neat stack and looked back at my husband, then at his attorney, then at my father-in-law. "What concerns this court," she said evenly, "is not the request for divorce. That is not unusual. What concerns this court is the apparent attempt to engineer an outcome by misrepresenting facts, coordinating testimony, and positioning one party as unstable to justify disproportionate demands." The word unstable hung in the air, stripped of its power. My husband swallowed hard. The judge closed the folder. "We will be recessing," she said. "This matter will be reviewed further, and until that review is complete, no additional actions will be taken." She paused, just long enough for the weight of her words to settle. "Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," my husband's attorney said, her voice tight. As the judge rose and exited the courtroom, the room erupted into quiet chaos. Whispered arguments, frantic glances. My husband turned toward me, his expression no longer smug, no longer confident. Confused. Afraid. For the first time since this began, he didn't know what came next. And I realized something as I gathered my things and prepared to leave. I hadn't taken anything from him yet. I had simply taken away his certainty. The rest would follow. The hallway outside the courtroom felt longer than it had when I walked in. People moved around me in low murmurs. Attorneys whispering into phones, clerks shuffling papers, strangers brushing past without knowing what had just shifted inside that room. My husband stood a few steps behind me, frozen, as if the ground had subtly tilted, and he hadn't yet found his balance. He didn't call my name. For the first time, he didn't know which version of me he was supposed to speak to. I stepped outside into the daylight and breathed in slowly. Not in relief, not in triumph, just in acknowledgement that something final had ended, not the marriage. That had been over long before the filing. What ended was the illusion that I could be managed quietly. The phone in my hand vibrated once, then again. I didn't look. Some victories don't need witnesses. Some justice doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives with silence, with people realizing too late that the story they prepared no longer belongs to them. In the days that followed, the shift became visible. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when I entered rooms. Messages arrived carefully worded, polite, restrained. People who had once avoided my eyes now watched me closely, trying to understand where they had misjudged me. My father-in-law didn't reach out at all. That told me everything. The court's review took time. That was expected. Systems don't unwind overnight, especially ones built on quiet cooperation and unquestioned authority. But the process had changed direction, and everyone involved knew it. So did my husband. He tried once, weeks later, to speak to me privately, not to apologize, not to explain, to test. He asked how I was holding up. I smiled, just enough to be polite. "Better than you expected," I said. He didn't ask anything else. What followed wasn't dramatic. There were no public apologies, no grand reversals, just recalibration, terms adjusted, assumptions corrected, decisions reconsidered under scrutiny that no longer felt optional. Control doesn't disappear when it's challenged. It fractures. And once fractured, it never quite fits the same way again. I wasn't awarded everything. I didn't need to be. What I gained mattered more than numbers on paper. I reclaimed authorship over my voice, over my story, over the version of me that had been quietly rewritten without my consent. I learned something important through all of this. People like to believe justice looks loud, that revenge requires spectacle, that strength announces itself. It doesn't. Real power is quiet. It waits, it listens. It understands when to speak and when to let others expose themselves. It doesn't rush to be believed. It builds a record that can't be ignored. They thought my silence meant surrender. They were wrong. It meant preparation. When I look back now, the moment that matters most isn't when the judge spoke, or when my husband's confidence collapsed, or even when the narrative finally cracked. It was the moment I stopped trying to convince anyone of who I was. The moment I trusted that truth, placed carefully and patiently, would always outlast manipulation. If you're listening to this, and you've ever felt dismissed, underestimated, quietly pushed aside by people who assumed you wouldn't notice or wouldn't fight back, remember this. You don't need to raise your voice to be heard. You don't need to rush to defend yourself. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay still long enough for the truth to catch up. If this story resonated with you, if you've lived a moment where patience became your greatest strength, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experience in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if you want more stories like this, stories about hidden power, quiet revenge, and the kind of justice that doesn't shout but never misses, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel and keep listening. Because some endings don't close doors. They remind you that you were never locked in at all. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.